Silpunk, xenophobia, and science fiction. For the uninitiated, only one of these words should be familiar. Fear not, for in this podcast we will define what these three words mean, along with analyzing Chinese science fiction and the representation of Chinese culture both in China and around the world. Hi, my name is Derek Zhu, and I will be interviewing a graduate student named Jiangfeng He here at the University of Washington. In this podcast, we will also analyze a critically acclaimed work of Chinese science fiction. The Three-Body Problem is the first book in a trilogy written by Liu Cixin and translated by Ken Liu. As a general summary, the story is about a complex struggle between humans and an invading alien species. The story was originally written in Mandarin and features a primarily Chinese cast. I would highly recommend reading the books.
Would you like to introduce yourself, Mr. Jianfeng?
I'm an English PhD student in the English department. My work is focused on 20th century and 21st century American literature and the construction of democratic sociality.
In general, literature in the West has had very low amounts of ethnic representation of Southeast Asian nations, especially Chinese literature. Why do you think that would be the case?
It's so deeply and complexly intricated with global history, with the Western history of racialization and global colonial history. We're talking about literature in the West. So for non-Western literature to have a high visibility, high reception, they need to have really appealing translations. And that might be part of the problem.
In addition, Chinese science fiction literature has only recently started to blow up. Why do you think it took so long for this genre to gain popularity?
If you think of Chinese literature in PRC, to a certain degree, it kind of emerged after Cultural Revolution in the post-socialist period. The reason why it regained popularity has a lot to do with the rise of discourse of science, science and technology, and the opening up and the reform policy in post now China. So science fiction might have been regarded as something that is closer to scientific truth. It was seen as one way for Chinese literature to be welcomed into global literature.
What were the effects of Chinese science fiction literature in the culture in the Chinese mainland?
So many people at the time, after the crackdown of the foregone, and after the open up and reform policy, ideological, political, cultural debates seem to enter a cul-de-sac situation. And for many people believe that for Chinese literature to have to be revitalized, science fiction and sci-fi was a way out.
I hear that Chinese science fiction is also heavily scrutinized by the Chinese government's Ministry of Culture. Do you have any intrigue on the CCP's view of science fiction in general?
The reason why science fiction regained popularity at the beginning is because writers and public audience, they somehow thought that science fiction can be a way for literature to get rid of all these political ideological burdens, to be focused on the objective scientific exploration of humanity, of the world. And that political censorship has not been as much practiced on science fiction as it did on other, more conventional, more mainstream literary genres, like just literary fiction or historical novels.
In the book The Three-Body Problem, how would you say Liu Cixin represents Asian culture and history throughout the story?
With all due respect to Liu Cixin and to his writing career and to the global fame of Three-Body Problems, I honestly find the novel problematic because there are some more social, historical, political issues that are more complex than is represented by him in the novel. That is probably the place where he has been most criticized.
Do you think that by referencing subjects and topics such as the Cultural Revolution and small tidbits of Chinese culture, Liu Cixin introduces lesser-known cultural topics to a Western audience?
In a sense, yes. Your Western readers, they they don't really care about among the original motivations for political leaders to launch the Cultural Revolution and the entire span of 10 years. All they care is just any materials that would work to reinforce their pre-established, previously upheld views, to learn the actual history of China and Chinese revolution and cultural revolution through reading novels. They're just reading to satisfy a certain sense of self-complacency.
So in a sense, though, Liu Cixin introduces a rather hidden and unknown era of Chinese history for many Western readers, the occurrence of something like the Cultural Revolution in the story is more so a titillating plot point that reinforces xenophobic and anti-Chinese sentiment than a cultural lesson in Chinese history.